Symposium. Almost a year into this stage of the war on Gaza, and as our advocacy grows stronger, all the resources that we can gather to empower ourselves in our fight for liberation is always appreciated. So thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Halima Twam, and I am the Civic Engagement and Advocacy Manager here at PACC. We are excited to listen and learn from all of you today and to continue to engage with our community in a very meaningful way. I ask that everyone here continue to invite others to the events that we have for Palestine education and for civic engagement, so that we can all continue to benefit from the work that we are doing as we strengthen our community and our efforts and our communication with one another. And then at the end, I'll talk more about the events that we have coming and the programs that we have here at PACC. So please stick around. And if you leave early, talk to Jenny on your way out. Oh, here we go. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for having us, PACC, and for that introduction. We're so impressed with this space. So today we're having our Uncomfortable Truths Symposium. We're so glad you all could join us. We have an incredible lineup here of speakers and organizations that I will introduce after we play a short video. The Muslim Legal Fund of America is a 501c3 organization. We are a federal litigation, essentially like a boutique law firm. We have a criminal defense litigation section that defends in national security prosecutions brought against Muslims. We have a civil litigation section that fights for the civil liberties of Muslims and discrimination matters and a whole variety of matters, watch list issues. And we have an immigration litigation department as well. So with that, can we play our short MLFA video? Thank you.
All right.
Oops, sorry.
Guys, let's just be real. Muslims in a post 9/11 America are literally just treated like potential terrorists. Criminal investigation, denial of immigration status. They even get me started on the Patriot Act. Just the dumb leech.
This is the police. Put your phone down now. What is this for? You guys have this is home music. You're under arrest. Do anything. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say, you guys will be held against you. I'm doing it literally. That's all.
Half of all Muslims in the US say it's become more difficult to be Muslim in America. Those whose appearance is identifiably Muslim are more likely to face discrimination. Law enforcement can legally engage in lengthy surveillance without any single fact that a person has ties to a terrorist organization. When 1/4 of adults in America think half or more of Muslims in the US are anti-American, how can Muslims possibly be treated fairly? We are the Muslim Legal Fund of America, and we exist to fight injustices in our federal legal system and beyond. We will hold America to a promise and will always stand firm against institutionalized Islamophobia, ensuring Muslim Americans have access to fair and equal justice under the law. Our expertise is unparalleled. Over the years, we've achieved incredible milestones upholding justice in our courtroom. MLFA is challenging the laws to influence the policies that harm Muslims in this country, but we can't achieve justice without you.
I support MLFA. They are doing incredibly critical work.
All right. So our symposium is purpose of it is to be a reflection on the Gaza impact over the past year. We've all been seeing, the news about the student protests, direct action, legal challenges, all these new laws that are being discussed, and everyone is fighting this on a lot of different fronts. The repercussions are looking different for everyone, and a lot of different organizations, activists are handling different aspects of it. So this symposium is to bring all of us together and highlight some of this important work that's doing and hear from the experts in this field on all of these different aspects, and then give you all a chance to ask questions about things that you hear discussed today or that are relevant to all of the different expertise that we have on this panel. Fatima Mohammed, who was our student protester, community organizer, was unable to make it today. She's sick, but we did want to ground the conversation and center it in a lot of this new wave of everything we're seeing and how important that is. And so we do have attorneys here from Palestine Legal and CARE and Empower that also are very involved in that work, see the impacts of it, and so they will try their best as well to speak on that topic. So with that, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists and our moderators. So starting with myself, my name is Cynthia Khalid. I'm a senior staff attorney in the Criminal Defense Department at MLFA. I've been there for 5 years, defending Muslims and others who are discriminated against and targeted by the FBI, charged in unconstitutional national security prosecutions. I represent clients pre-indictment, at trial, on appeals, and in post-conviction matters. Our cases typically involve FBI entrapment, anti-Muslim bias, secret evidence, mass surveillance, and other constitutional issues. Prior to that, I worked at the UN War Crimes Tribunal on Khmer Rouge war crimes in Cambodia, and at the Legal Aid Society in Manhattan. Our other moderator, Janan Shahada, who's at the far other end, she recently graduated from Georgetown Law in Washington, D.C. Janan is a co-founder and previous chair of SJP Chicago and the president of the Students for Justice in Palestine at DePaul University. She's also the co-founder and co-president of Law Students for Justice in Palestine at Georgetown Law. She previously worked in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the ACLU. Janan is currently a staff attorney with the Civil Litigation Department at the Muslim Legal Fund of America. Now our panelists. Yasmin. Yasmin Taib currently serves as Legislative and Political Director for Empower Change Action Fund. Yasmin fled Iran during the Iran-Iraq War and grew up undocumented before becoming a citizen, lawyer, and activist. In 2016, she became the first Muslim woman elected to the Democratic National Committee. She has over 15 years of legislative experience, during which she worked on Capitol Hill, served as Senior Policy Counsel at Demand Progress, as Senior Policy Counsel at the Center for Victims of Torture. She's directed the Human Rights and Civil Liberties Program at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, lobbying for increased resettlement of refugees, the closure of the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, and repeal of the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs. She holds a JD from Penn State, a graduate certificate in international human rights law from Oxford University, and bachelor's from the University of Florida. Next, we have Dylan Saba. Dylan is a lawyer and writer living here in Queens, New York. He is currently a staff attorney at Palestine Legal, where he advises Palestine advocates on civil rights matters. His writing has appeared in a number of publications, including The Nation, Foreign Policy, N+1, American Prospect, The Baffler, and Jewish Currents. Dylan is both Palestinian American and Jewish American, and he's been very involved in representing a lot of, working with a lot of the students on everything that's been seen happening on the campuses this year, and a lot of the anti-Palestinian legislation as well. Next, we have Hani Mirza. Hani is an experienced voting rights litigator, policy expert, and activist. He currently serves as a senior staff attorney in the Advancement Project's Power and Democracy program, working on voting rights issues across the country. He previously served as the Texas Civil Rights Project's Voting Rights Program Director, where he led the largest litigation, policy, and advocacy program focused on voting rights in Texas. Next, we have Sheza. Sheza Abushi Dalal is a staff attorney with the CLEAR CUNY Clinic, that's Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility. CLEAR's mandate is to support Muslim, South Asian, Arab, and all other clients, communities, and movements nationwide that are targeted by local, state, or federal government agencies under the guise of so-called national security and counterterrorism policies and practices. Prior to joining CLEAR, Sheza was an appellate public defender at the Office of the Appellate Defender, where she provided holistic, client-centered representation to people convicted of felonies in Manhattan and the Bronx. Sheza is a graduate of CUNY Law School, where she was a student attorney in CLEAR's clinic and completed internships at the ACLU's Human Rights Program, Palestine Legal, and the Federal Defenders for the Southern District of New York. Oh, okay. You were saying.
Oh, sorry.
That's not Sheza. That is Salahuddin Maksud. Salahuddin is a recognized civil rights leader who has dedicated his career to advancing Muslim civil rights in New Jersey. As executive director at CARE New Jersey, Maksud leads a team of dedicated professionals and guides CARE New Jersey as it seeks to enhance the understanding of Islam, encourage dialogue, protect civil liberties, empower American Muslims, and build coalitions that promote justice and mutual understanding. Salah received his master's degree in Islamic studies with a specialization in the pre-modern convergence of Sufism and Islamic political theory from Columbia University, and his bachelor's in religious studies from NYU. Salah has traveled to Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, and throughout the Balkans in pursuit of traditional studies of Islam and Muslim societies. So we have a pretty great group of panelists here. The format for the symposium panel is going to be, we've divided this into 4 topics. So we'll cover the first 2 topics, then there'll be a brief time for a short Q&A on those topics. We'll do the second 2 topics, and then there will be a longer time for Q&A after that, and a time to come up and talk to the speakers if you would like. So starting with our first topic, we're going to be talking about activism, organizing, and free speech concerns that we particularly noticed in the last year. How many of you in the audience took part in some type of activism, organizing, or advocacy this past year? Raise your hands. All right, almost everyone. For how many of you was this your first time getting involved that way? All right, so some people. Dylan, this past year we've seen an incredible wave of student activism, community organizing. Organizations like yours, Palestine Legal, have been a first-line resource for many of the issues that have come up for these individuals. Can you give us a breakdown of the different types of activism that we've seen both on and off campus this year?
Sure, you can jump there. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for coming out. I love that this first question I'm getting is to talk about and uplift the amazing organizing that people are doing. Normally when I'm asked to speak on a panel, I'm asked to talk about repression and all the bad things that these institutions are doing, which I'm sure I will spend most of my time today talking about. But it is really amazing what students and members of the community have been able to do over the past, harrowing past 11 months. We've seen, the initial responses, after October 7th and the start of the genocide, we saw a number of statements from student groups and other institutions and individuals in support of Palestinian rights and Palestinian liberation. We started to see eventually ceasefire resolutions being passed at municipalities and other institutions as well, such as unions. I'm sure many of you have seen the tremendous marches that grassroots organizations have put together consistently over the past 11 months that have turned out hundreds of thousands of people into the streets, including a massive march in November. We've seen a number of direct actions, and those have been at universities, they have been at media institutions and elsewhere to draw attention to the Palestinian cause, and sometimes shut down some bridges and other pretty cool stuff. We've seen a tremendous amount of public education work. This has been a time in which a lot of folks are being exposed to the issue of Palestine, maybe for the first time. They're young, or maybe they've just never paid attention, and it's grabbing headlines in a way that is creating an audience for education. And a lot of important work has been done in that space. There's been a ton of work to build cross-movement coalitions, so build bridges between the Palestine Solidarity Movement and other movements, the movement for Black Lives, environmental movements, the fight to stop Cop City and Atlanta. All of that has been really inspiring. In the spring, we saw the explosion of the student movement into what many are calling a student intifada, where students were organizing encampments to demand that their universities divest from genocide and from apartheid. And we even saw escalations in that space as well, as students took buildings and occupied buildings to uplift their demands. And that has, a lot of it was met with very violent repression, as I'm sure you've seen, and in other instances, students were able to win concessions from their universities. And then the final area of activism that I will uplift is in the realm of BDS, which for folks involved in the Palestine movement is very familiar. And there's been major headway in BDS organizing and the progress towards divestment on campuses, and also some major headway in the cultural sphere as well, with media institutions signing on to the PACC call, and other endorsements as well, some from major unions. So I think I'll stop there. That's a broad overview of the different mobilizations that we've seen, and if I've forgotten anything important, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, Legal really stepped up and took charge of ensuring good representation and resources for the activists taking direct action and protesting. Can you tell us what that looked like in the very first few months? I know it was just a massive influx. And then what types of repression you guys saw?
Yes, so I mentioned that the first thing I said when I talked about what people's organizing response was to this moment was the release of statements, and those proved to be quite controversial and caused a lot of problems. In that they were the source of a lot of the first signs of repression from institutions, right? So what happened immediately after October 7th is you had student organizations, student groups, SJPs, etc., publishing statements supporting Palestinian liberation, and that caused a major panic at the level of institutions. So we had widespread condemnations from universities, and we also saw discrimination and retaliation in the realm of employment. So you had panic that was especially in trade industries and law in particular as a field. We saw a lot of institutions revoking offers of employment for students having been a part of an organization that released a statement supporting Palestinian liberation after October 7th. We also saw the targeted doxing of students. So students who were members of those organizations had their faces blasted on digital billboards that were driven around campus. People were filmed engaging in acts of political expression. That video was then fed into the right-wing media circuit of the Murdoch empire, so it was getting blasted onto Fox News. So I would have clients who are 19 years old who are coming to us in a panic because their face is on the Megyn Kelly show and they're hearing about it from members of their family. So that was the initial response after October 7th, was a series of the statements and then the backlash to the statements and the doxing. The next wave was in censorship, right? So you had media figures who were brought, were offered or asked to come on air for example, to speak about Palestine and give some context, and they were told that there's certain things that they can't say. And if they refused, sometimes they were just told that their segment was cut or that they weren't able to speak at all. We saw censorship in the form of particular phrases associated with Palestinian liberation, being told that this is a form of anti-Semitism and this is something you can't say. Things like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" was labeled hate speech and told that that was not acceptable public expression. We saw then the kind of next wave of repression took the form in the targeting, at least with respect to the campuses, targeting individuals and groups that are involved in campus organizing, right? So then the student groups kicked into gear, right? It wasn't just statements. They started holding protests on campus, organizing teach-ins, etc. And the universities responded by trying to isolate the leaders of these organizations and bring disciplinary charges against them. And that escalated then into banning whole groups. These got major headlines, but there, Students for Justice in Palestine and a number of institutions were banned outright. Even the anti-Zionist Jewish organizations in a number of academic institutions were banned as well. So the universities took the approach of, okay, it's not working to censor, it's not working to pick off individuals. We have to just get this, activism off of our campus, full stop. Now, of course, the student movement was not, intimidated and did not go away and continued to escalate when their demands were not met, and also escalate in the face of this repression. And what did the universities do? They sicked the police on their students, right? So the students escalated to launching the encampments that I mentioned, and many universities across the country called in police officers and state troopers to brutalize these students. So that I'll stop there in terms of an overview of repression, but rest assured, the movement is strong, and the students are strong, and the intimidation and repression will not work.
Sheza, the Clear CUNY project does high impact work on holding overreaching law enforcement accountable. When protesters, campus activists, and organizers began their advocacy for Gaza, what trends did you notice in their new interactions with law enforcement?
Yeah, and before sort of getting into my answer to that question, I just want to give context for Clear's work and our engagement in this type of, or engagement with organizers in this type of space. So Clear is a free legal clinic housed at CUNY School of Law, and we have historically provided a wide array of movements and communities and organizers with legal support and other forms of advice, particularly when it comes to their interactions with law enforcement agencies and security agencies. And so when we say law enforcement agencies, we're really talking about from like the local to the state to the municipal to the federal level, agencies like the FBI, local police, Customs and Border Protection, or the Transportation Security Administration at the airport. All of these are law enforcement agencies, and I'll be talking about them broadly throughout this symposium, and wanted to give that context. Yeah, so, Dylan mentioned that one of the things we saw immediately in lockstep with the onset of the genocide is a massive wave of protests and mobilizations against the genocide and for Palestinian liberation and Palestinian rights, immediately all over the country, and certainly in the tri-state area. Thousands of people were taking to the streets, and not like once per month, but rather on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and across sectors of society and communities in the city. Unprecedented mobilizations against war and for Palestine. And also in lockstep, we saw some serious police repression. And referring back to the history of Clear's work and the fact that we have worked with many movement organizations and communities, I think it's also important to say that contextualizes how I see, and we as an institution see, what these tactics are. And they're really like tried and tested repression tactics that the state has used for a very long time to target and surveil and repress movements for liberation and social justice in this country and other communities. And so speaking concretely about what we saw, on the one hand, you had sort of these regular mobilizations and protests, and immediately from the earliest protests and with increasing escalation since, police were responding with intense police brutality, regular and rampant arrests of protesters, engaging in regular protest activity, and yeah, just again, police brutality, like really intense violence against protesters. And so on a regular basis, protesters for Palestine and against this genocide were finding themselves spending hours, if not more, in local police holding cells, and returning to the streets, sometimes as soon as the next day or the next week. And in some of these cases, people were dealing with resulting criminal cases, but even where, prosecutors were choosing not to prosecute severely these cases, what people were experiencing is what a colleague of mine has been calling punishment by process, where regardless of what was happening in the criminal arena, there's like a tax imposed on their bodies and their experiences and their engagement with this really important dissent and protest. And that same type of like imposed tax we saw in other domains as well. So in the border context, folks from Muslim, South Asian, Arab, Palestinian communities in the States for 2 decades now and longer, I think, know that the border, airports, land borders, people get majorly harassed from these communities and have been for a long time by law enforcement agencies, questioned at length about topics that do not relate to things like their immigration or their entry into the country, searched, humiliated, targeted. It's a long-standing practice, and I think we've seen over the course of the past year that tactic used against people with perceived associations to Palestine or Palestine organizing. So people getting questioned at the border about their protest activity, about their views on what's happening in Gaza, about people in their community, for Palestinians and people with connections to Palestine, about people there and their connections to them, an uptick in this type of scrutiny at the border by agencies like Customs and Border Protection. And then, certainly the other context is like law enforcement contact of the more like traditional local and federal, so the FBI agencies making contact with organizers, and doing things like door knocks and calls to ask about protest activity, social media posts, sometimes information that surfaces about a person as part of doxing campaigns. We've seen that happen quite a bit. And again, like these are older practices of all of these law enforcement agencies that have now been mobilized against communities of people that are speaking out against the genocide.
Thank you. Salah, we know many of these activists and organizers have personally and amongst their friends experienced serious repercussions, including censorship, harassment, doxing, everything we've been talking about. The impact of this can be really intense for such young people at the beginning of their lives. Can you tell us generally some of the impacts you're seeing with these activists and younger people that you talk to?
Absolutely. Spend that. So a lot was shared about the impacts and what's happening in universities, but we forgot about the high schools and how much this is impacting high school students. And in New Jersey, I can tell you a few different cases where students were kind of emboldened, right? They are seeing what's happening in the universities and they want to participate too. And in many cases, they were faced also with repercussions, right, and retaliation from their high school's administration, and in some cases even from congressmen. You know, in Jersey, there was a situation where Congressman Josh Gottheimer actually targeted students in Teaneck, right, for their efforts to organize walkouts. And in other cases, you know, the administration very clearly demonstrates a bias, right, where they permit a walkout for other groups in the past. And not only permit, but they actually participate, support, assist with the logistics. And then in case of Palestinian walkouts for pro-Palestinian cause, there's repercussion, there's retaliation, there's action taken against students, you know, parents are called in, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a defining moment for a lot of these young kids. In some cases, what's happening now in their high schools or in their universities will determine what they do next. It determines how they're going to map out their careers. And what, you know, one of the services that we provide at CARE is a lot of youth development work, empowering and encouraging young people to get involved civically, and to pursue careers and become attorneys, elected officials, activists, advocates, etc. And this year, I can tell you from some of our programming, we've had a high demand for our educational workshops, and some of our like hallmark events where we have young people come to hear from experts like this panel and others who do this for a living. So young people are optimistic, have been emboldened, have been encouraged to continue the fight. It's always a challenge too. I actually, you know, was facing a difficulty myself when I was speaking at the Princeton encampment, and I had one student come up to me and ask me, you know, my parents, they really don't want me to be here. And I don't know what to do. And they were, you know, calling him and texting him and like, you have to come home, you have to come home, you're not safe there, like you have to leave. And he's like, what do I do? What do I do? And it's really hard to answer these questions. It's like, well, what kind of advice are you gonna give? It's like, you have to make the decision on your own. And, you know, you have to understand what can happen and how your actions will impact, you know, what happens next will be impacted by what you do right here, right now. And the repercussions that are there, the retaliation that might be taken against you. And so I think it's educating the students about what are their rights in that moment, what are the possible outcomes, and then they make that decision on their own, and it becomes a defining moment for so many. And I think, you know, with that, so many now are leaving STEM, sorry for the parents, and pursuing careers in the social sciences and the advocacy and the legal route, which is, you know, great to see. Because it's going to strengthen our ability to execute, defend, and protect our community. But yeah.
It's so important, and I hope we all kind of keep an eye out for the younger people that are getting involved and need support and advice. Dylan, in regards to these repercussions we're talking about, what is PAL Legal expecting to see on campuses next? Are there resources to support these students and frontline activists with the long-term effects of this public backlash?
So I'm going to take these questions separately. First, I'll talk about what to expect next, and I'll assume next is referring to this academic year that's starting now. And then I'll talk about resources and long-term effects. So the question of what to expect next is in some senses very difficult, because the kind of repression that we're going to see will depend on what the students do. And what the students do depends on the political conditions, right? We are in a moment of profound uncertainty about what's happening on the ground. There's conversations of a ceasefire exchange deal, there's conversations of kind of continued genocide and low-level, medium-level regional war, and then there's conversations of escalation. And I think each of those scenarios presents unique opportunities, challenges, conditions for students to navigate in, and that will affect the repression that they're facing. So in the event of de-escalation, then the challenge for students will be to continue to uplift their demands, right? Because there will be a massive pressure to shift the camera away from Palestine, in any event of de-escalation. And so that will be, probably like a higher emphasis on public education as opposed to mobilization and thinking along those strategies. If we maintain the status quo, then the challenge will be to keep attention on Palestine, right? And that would probably look like continued, marches, mobilizations, etc. But I don't know exactly what students would do. And in the event of escalation, there are all kinds of challenges and opportunities that might engender in terms of widening the base of the movement. Insofar as escalation draws in U.S. military involvement and the movement kind of shifts in form into a wider anti-war mobilization, all of these things will shape the kind of repression that students are facing. The one thing that we do know is that universities are trying to prepare, right? And so they're preparing by looking at what the students did in the spring and trying to prevent that from happening again. So they are changing their policies to anticipate more encampments. I'm not sure if there will be more encampments, but that's what the university administrations are preparing for. And they are shifting their policy to more effectively silence pro-Palestine expression on campuses. And the way that they're doing that principally is to make protections for Zionism, to say that Zionism is an ideology. It's not simply an ideology that you hold, but it is a characteristic that brings anti-discrimination protections, as in a race or a religion. Now, that is not an accurate understanding of how anti-discrimination law works in the United States, but there are powerful forces that are trying to insist that that's not true. And so that's going to be a major fight in this academic year, is to fight back against those policies, to challenge them where possible and expose them for being a politically motivated project and actually not rooted in principles of anti-discrimination. In terms of the second question, which is, are there resources to support these students with the long-term effects of the public backlash? So I'll say, in the long term, we're going to win. So there won't be any issues for the students. In the medium term, there may be some issues, right? But the answer is still the movement, right? So what we can do as a movement to protect these young students is to create environments for them, right? To create spaces where their correct political views are celebrated and uplifted, and not viewed as marginal or wrong in any capacity, right? It's actually on us as a community to create opportunities for these students, because at the end of the day, yeah, there are going to be institutions that are going to want to repress them, that are going to have the same set of influence that these institutions that are engaged in this crackdown to begin with are facing as well. And so, and then in the short term, in the short to medium term, right, we can provide resources. So we can provide a legal defense, against criminal accusations, against accusations in student conduct processes, but we can also engage in advocacy too, right? So part of how this kind of repression and the knock-on effects of the repression works is, a controversy is ginned up, and then that is just a kind of dark cloud that follows the issue of Palestine, right? So an employer, for example, will see that there's some controversy around a potential applicant, maybe see that they have been smeared by some websites that they've never heard of, and that they're being called an anti-Semite, and they might just say, okay, this one, we'll go with someone else, right? But there's a saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So one thing that we can do to mitigate these harms, right, is to expose the lobby and expose these smear sites and expose the tactics for what they are. Because as soon as people learn about what Canary Mission is, they immediately will be able to discern that this is not a credible source of anything. And really having a Canary Mission page is it's a good thing. It's it demonstrates that a student was engaged in political advocacy, and so in the short and medium term, we can take steps to mitigate the kind of reputational harms that some of these students are dealing with, and show them that, yes, there are risks to engaging in activism. Yes, there are particular risks to engaging in this kind of activism, but we will support you as best as you can to be brave, because that's what we're asking. That's what we're asking of everyone in this moment and in this movement is to be brave, and to get each other's backs.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to shift a little bit now to talking about the impact, of some of this, the positive side of it. But before that, because we're lawyers, I do have to give a disclaimer on behalf of MLFA. So because MLFA is a 501c3 organization, we are not allowed to endorse or advocate against any particular political candidate or political party. So any of the opinions expressed in this program don't necessarily reflect the views of MLFA or those that they represent. Also, nothing here today is specifically legal advice to you. We would encourage anyone that wants legal advice on any of the topics we're talking about to reach out to people on this panel or these organizations directly, and we would be more than happy to speak with you. So Yasmin, what impact has this impressive wave of activism and organizing for Gaza that we've seen had on federal and congressional lobbying efforts in your work compared to past efforts? What has this widespread activism changed or helped?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Sophia, for the question. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to MLFA for organizing this incredibly important symposium. So thinking about the question about, we've all seen just the massive rallies, the massive protests, millions taking action. We saw everybody in the audience raise their hands in terms of whether you've taken any advocacy since October 7th in support of Palestinian human rights. And we also saw some folks raise their hands saying this was the first time you kind of took action in terms of civic engagement, whether it was lobbying or attending a protest. So for me, when I again think about this question, I've been doing federal lobbying now. Talked a little bit about this before we started. Can't believe it, but it's been at least 15 years. Can't believe I'm still doing it. It's not really fun, but but the only time I can think of that I can compare what we've seen in terms of just the amount of engagement, massive protests, millions of letters being sent to Congress. The only other thing that compared to it was the Muslim ban that I remember. And I organized a lot of kind of the national rallies around the ban in Washington, D.C. at the White House. The thing, as folks remember, that was different with that was, right, the administration the person that was in the White House was not from the party that, sorry, so I guess this is why this is to be said. But so I run in Power C4. I'm going to be kind of very blunt about, we support progressive candidates, progressive policies. We've never supported a Republican candidate. And I'm a registered Democrat. So with the Muslim ban, the difference with engagement then was, yes, the administration that was in the White House was not from the party that most folks from our community, right, identified with. So, it was different and easier for lawmakers also in Capitol Hill, obviously, Democrats to come out against the policy because it was a different party. Right now, it's been really interesting to see how, for example, Democrats in the House and Senate have responded to the activism from folks in our community and in the broader ceasefire movement, because a lot of the asks from our communities, right, is absolutely not consistent with the current administration, Democratic administration. So a lot of Democrats in Congress had to, step away and distance themselves from this administration's policies. A lot of them very early on, including my member of Congress, Representative Don Beyer of Northern Virginia. And I there's so many of us that like, the first week after October 7th, we contacted him and we wanted him to publicly come out in support of an immediate lasting ceasefire. And he eventually did, and he's one of the very first members. I mean, he's in leadership, he's very close to the president, but we saw that happening very quickly. It was no longer 5 or 6 members of the squad. There were kind of mainstream moderate Democrats that were distancing themselves from the administration. And that itself was incredibly unique. There were so many different votes that were taken that I would say was truly unprecedented, and it was directly in response to the massive activism and grassroots engagement and in support of Palestinian human rights. For example, 37 Democrats, very first time, did not support the Israel supplemental. Again, has never happened. They voted no in providing offensive arms to Israel. We had more than 100 members of Congress that skipped Netanyahu's speech. Again, incredibly significant. I know it's hard to kind of see these as wins because unfortunately now we're nearing 1 year into this Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, but those are kind of the things I think about in terms of, we would not have even seen that if it wasn't for this kind of massive grassroots effort and support for Palestinian human rights.
That's amazing, and I think having the context for the impact it's having and how effective it's been, and giving that credit is important for the whole community. Hani, so we're going to talk more about the upcoming election later, but what impact do you think Gaza activists and organizers have had on elections in the past year?
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me here, and I also just want to point out I'm here in my personal capacity as a voting rights activist and attorney. To answer your question, I kind of want to start off by saying that mobilized movements are some of the most powerful forces to create pressure and make change. They're stronger than any election, even elections for president. And as a movement lawyer, I've seen this time and time again. I've seen what happens when people fill a hearing room at the state legislature. Politicians by nature are anxious, and they're ready to give up on anything if they see pressure. And I've seen people fill a room, just filling a room, kill a bad bill. That would have like grave implications for people across a state, or even within a city or county. And what we're seeing now here are people filling whole cities in protest. And the protesters out there are giving the demands of the movement, making clear what they want. You hear calls for ceasefire, ending the genocide. And what we're seeing is that with those protests, the political parties and politicians at even the local level are feeling the pressure. And it's something that they can't ignore anymore. In the past, it was easy to kind of, for a lot of these politicians to make their statements about kind of general statements and ignore the genocide or violence happening against people in Palestine. And now that doesn't fly anymore. And essentially what's happened is that these protesters have forced people in, especially the Democratic Party, to make a stance, to give a stance on what they think about what's happening. And that is huge. And I think, we'll see what happens in the following months, and then also the following years. There are other elections to come. There are going to be consequences for all parties involved in the election. And we'll see how that pans out. But these protesters are, as Malcolm X says, making it plain. and these parties are forced to respond and give a response.
Thank you. Sheza, these repercussions we've been talking about earlier, especially the attempts to criminalize Gaza advocacy, right? They've been demoralizing, even scary for a lot of people at times, but we haven't seen a decrease in the activism. We're seeing continued and growing support for Gaza. Why do you think that is? You're working with a lot of these individuals in a professional capacities. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. I think it's an important thing to sort of wrap up this part of our conversation. I think what I see on a daily basis working with organizers is just complete clarity about what is at stake. And that's a very powerful thing. Just yesterday night, I saw an organizer speaking to a room of people that mobilize on a weekly basis and have been since the onset of this genocide. And they were commenting on the NYPD's, just this past week, an NYPD officer almost took a man's life over their failure to pay a $2.90 subway fare. And this organizer said to this room of folks, we know that the going rate for human life today in New York is $2.90, and in Gaza it's $0. I think people understand that this moment is as much about death as it is about life and like liberation, and are very empowered by that. That's what I see on a regular basis in the organizers that we work with. And then I think the second thing that is keeping people going is that the same people that are activated in this moment to fight against this genocide are people that are empowered by experiences that they have had before and that their communities have had before. And what do I mean by that? A lot of the young organizers who are mobilizing right now were activated in other very repressive moments, like in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the uprisings for Black Lives in the summer of 2020, in very repressed movements for environmental justice, folks mobilizing to Standing Rock and around the country for this planet, and against, how the state is destroying it. And these are movements that have been, and those are just sort of two examples, but movements that were very repressed by the state and other actors around them, and persevered against those costs. And then, in Muslim and Arab and South Asian communities, I know this is true on the local level, but this is true across the country. These communities, we are not where we were in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Why? Because we have the past 2 decades under our belt of experience navigating law enforcement scrutiny and scrutiny by the state and criminalization and repression. And there are organizations represented in this room and many beyond that were built up trying to equip people with the skills to deal with that repression and have been active for years since. So we have all of that knowledge under our belts. We're much more equipped to keep our doors shut to law enforcement. An example of this is, I don't know if people are on law enforcement contact TikTok, but there was a video that went viral a few months ago of a woman somewhere in the States, I can't remember where, who had the FBI show up at her door to ask her about her Palestine social media posts. And not only did she not let them in, which years ago would have likely happened because of politeness and cultural norms and many other things, We don't even see the inside of her home. Instead, we're in the driveway. She's filming them, repeatedly saying, "Give me your business card. Who are you? How do I even know that you're with the FBI? I'm not going to speak with you without an attorney." And then we're with her on camera until the FBI agents like get into their car and like quickly drive off. And that's the moment that we're in. And I think that combination of clarity and skill and knowledge that we have collectively, that makes for really collective power that will take us a long way.
Thank you for that. All right, so we're going to shift gears a little bit now into our second topic. The second topic, we're going to be talking about charitable aid and fundraising in the last year, specifically for Gaza. So how many of you in the audience have donated more money for Palestine this year than probably the last 5 years combined? Right? And how many of you have felt worried about providing humanitarian aid or supporting your local pro-Palestine charity or pro-Palestine fundraisers? Right, and that's sad. All right, so, if anyone has questions from the first topic, just hold on to them. After this topic, we'll have some time for questions on those two. It's new. This new bill in the US that's targeting pro-Palestine nonprofits, that'll be aimed at further curtailing Muslim nonprofits. Can you explain this new bill and the legal challenges that are being considered to tackle it?
Sure. So a lot of folks in the audience may have been kind of following the debate around, so initially HR 6408, I'm not even going to say the name of the bill because it's ridiculous. But it was passed out of the House shortly after its introduction last fall. Most in our community, even advocates, lobbying organizations, were not aware of what this bill was. It came up very quickly. It was put on the floor and it passed very easily, including even, support from members of the squad. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 members in the entire House that voted against it. And once we finally, our community kind of found out what this legislation was, and to give you a little kind of background around what it is. So it has this very confusing name, but essentially if the bill passes and becomes law and is signed by the president, it would give kind of this unilateral discretion to any administration, including mainly the Secretary of Department of Treasury, to strip the tax exempt status of our nonprofits. And this bill kind of came into being, it was very clearly done for the intention of targeting organizations advocating for ceasefire and Palestinian human rights. And the reason this is incredibly dangerous, and at this point, there's over 100 organizations that have come out in opposition. ACLU is very vigorously right now lobbying against it. I'll get into a little bit about this new legislation that just passed, markup that includes this tax. But after it passed the House, our community started organizing against it because we noticed that the Senate was considering taking it up, but because of kind of this vigorous advocacy by organizations in the Muslim, Arab, American community, Palestinian, pro-Palestinian advocacy, and namely really the ACLU was kind of the main group that was doing a lot of the lobbying. The Senate did not take it up, and it kind of died, and we thought, okay, great, so this is out of the way. Last week, there's this new legislation that passed out of committee unanimously, 38-0, the new bill number, and I'll just give you the bill number, and I'll tell you the name, because again, it's very confusing, HR 9495, it's called Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act. Anyways, so that legislation, part of it actually does good things. So the good parts of that bill is that it's trying to prevent the IRS in imposing penalties on Americans that are detained or held as hostages abroad. So namely, they've used Jason Rezaian as an example, as folks may know. I mean, I'm Iranian American, so I'm kind of familiar with his case. Like 10 years ago, he was detained and held by Iran, and while he was there for, I don't know, over 365 days, I believe, he was being taxed and getting penalties by the IRS. This bill, however, also includes the text of HR 6408, the one that targets our organizations. And namely, the reason this is done is because Republican offices that are trying to get this legislation passed, the one that targets our organizations for advocating for Palestinian human rights, they've now wrapped it into this other legislation that does some good things, hoping that they'll confuse members, hoping that it passes the House again and it goes to the Senate, and this time hoping that it passes the Senate. The reason why I highlight this is because last week, when it passed out of committee, there wasn't a single Democrat that voted no. I mean, it passed 38-0. So even folks on that committee that are our friends, so Representative Beyer, my member, is on that committee, Representative Doggett in particular spoke about the concerns of HR 6408, but then ultimately he voted yes, right? He was like, I have concerns about some of the due process on this, that it may be targeting some organizations advocating for Palestinian human rights, but then he was like, well, this bill overall does a lot of good things, so I'm going to support it. And I just wanted to highlight really how problematic this legislation is, and it really will have devastating impacts on so many of our organizations that are really fighting for, Palestinian liberation, human rights, ceasefire. As I noted, because it provides kind of this new and expansive power to any future administration. So, for example, if we have Trump coming in, next year, I mean, there's really nothing that could, if this passes and becomes law, there's nothing that's stopping him from labeling any and all of our organizations as organizations that are providing material support to terrorist groups. And the administration is not mandated to provide any sort of evidence to these organizations. There's no due process. They will strip the tax-exempt status of these organizations without providing any opportunity for the organizations to actually contest these facts. Sorry, I know it's a little depressing, but.
No, it's a very concerning bill that we've been looking at. So here in New Jersey, you all have also been looking at how to address this bill. Can you give us some examples of what you think the impact would be?
Yes, actually, just yesterday we were sitting with Bonnie Watson-Coleman, who unfortunately did sign in support of the bill. She herself was asking us, what's the big deal, right? Because it's framed in this way. It's like, of course we support this, right? But it's so redundant. I mean, there already exist laws and regulations that prevent this type of the effort that it seeks to accomplish. But in short, it's a type of fear-mongering. It scares our community into submission. It makes us overthink and think again and think again. Can I give money here? Can I give money there? Can I participate in this activity? Can the masjid organize this effort? Can the masjid send its funds it just collected at Jummah to this organization, this 501c3 nonprofit, right? Every house of worship, every civil rights organization, every advocacy organization, whether it's MLFA, CARE, or others, Empower Change, having to overthink every action, every step, because this law hangs over their head. And then say the designation does happen, right? And the organization is now subject to investigation. What does this do? Ultimately, it paralyzes the organization. You are subject to audits, investigation, and now say you are designated and you do fail and you violated the law and your designation is as a 501c3 is revoked, and now you want to appeal and you want to bring a litigation against, and you want to fight. This pauses all of your efforts. This freezes all of the advocacy work. And this is simply an attempt to make it harder for us to do what we already do. And again, it's a redundant law. Obviously, there are already measures that prevent what it's seeking to do. So there's no need for it. Instead, it's just a fear tactic to scare our community into submission, to to instill a bit of fear so that we don't move, so we are constantly second guessing, so our masajid don't participate in these activities. In many cases it does work, and in some cases you can even see banking while Muslim, right? The phenomenon, the issue that Muslims have and the struggles that Muslims have in their bank accounts being closed without explanation. And I think the letter that, I forget the senator who authored the letter, asked for the IRS to disclose what the banks are sharing with them in terms of who is involved in what activities, to make it public, to make it known, whose accounts were closed, for what suspicious behavior, what activities. So people are obviously concerned how to move forward. And ultimately, this is what we're fighting against. And it's something that we are actively doing here in New Jersey as well. It's unfortunate to see so many in the House have moved forward to advance it. I don't know, as you described in the Senate, what's going to happen there. But yeah.
Thank you. So also on the topic of charities, yes, I mean, most of us were shocked and surprised when the U.S. shut down funding for UNRWA. Can you talk about exactly how and why that happened, was able to happen, and what has happened with U.S. UNRWA funding since then?
Sure. So as folks may remember, the U.S. has historically been one of kind of UNRWA's top, largest financial supporters, and it paused funding following allegations that Israel made that there were 12 agency members, UNRWA employees that had direct involvement in the October 7th attacks. And then shortly after that, there was legislation, unfortunately, that passed both chambers in the appropriations bill that now has language in it that prohibits the U.S. from contributing to UNRWA. The only way now that can be reversed is if that language is repealed, which is where we are right now. So the UNRWA Restoration Act, it's actually legislation that's being introduced this week on Thursday. It's led by Representatives Carson, Jayapal, Chakowski. Right now it has over 60 original co-sponsors. My organization and so many others have been lobbying in support of this bill. And if you are able to, I would highly encourage you to call on your House member to serve as an original co-sponsor. It's again being introduced on Thursday, and the bill will specifically repeal the language that passed out of the fiscal year 24, as well as the Israel supplemental bill that would repeal that language prohibiting U.S. funding to going into UNRWA.
Great, that's a good call to action too for people that want to be able to get involved. Shaza, what are you seeing at the individual grassroots level regarding charitable donations and funding and sort of interactions with law enforcement?
Yeah, I think first of all, people have really risen to the occasion to do everything that they can to provide support and money to Gazans in Gaza and also folks who were trying to evacuate and made refugees multiple times over, and now in countries like Egypt for the foreseeable future. So we're seeing like massive mutual aid efforts and GoFundMes and fundraising efforts of all scales to meet those needs. And I think at the same time, the paradigm of fundraising and charitable donations is looking kind of different as it has before, or than it has before. I think especially for folks who are familiar and used to navigating the post 9/11 landscape of, government scrutiny of charitable donations and being careful about where you donate and how, you'll probably have heard historically the advice that it's best practice to donate to a registered nonprofit or charity. In other words, like a registered 501c3 in the States. and of course to have a lot of information about your donation and where it's going, and that remains best practice. I think a lot of people have seen, though, that they're not able to have the impact that they want to have and to help folks in Gaza through because of structural limitations through some of these, registered charities and other organizations that have licenses from the Department of Treasury to operate in Gaza, for example, or other locales. And so they're doing person-to-person donation. And I think we still are in an era of scrutiny, and it's hard to tell to what extent at this stage. But what I would propose to people is to introduce the reflex to be well documented in the fundraising that you engage in, and to seek support. There are a lot of legal organizations, including CLEAR, that have developed best practices and can provide, bespoke legal advice and look at your exact situation and tell you how best to navigate it. There are a lot of resources in this domain, and use them. It's as quick as a conversation about what you're trying to accomplish and how you can do it in a way that mitigates risk to you. We're in a moment of urgency, and so I totally understand why people rush to move and mobilize resources as quickly as possible, and know that the legal organizations that provide this support are willing and ready to move at that pace too with you, so you don't have to forfeit those steps. Okay.
All right, thank you. So that wraps up on charitable aid and fundraising. We're gonna have a short Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much to our panelists for beautifully and thoughtfully articulating these two huge buckets, right, of activism and organizing, and then also mutual aid and organizations. Are you guys all still with us? Yeah, I know we threw a lot of information at you guys, so that's why I wanted to quickly just take a quick break and take a few questions from the audience. So if anybody has any questions, they could just raise their hand. I know I have a few questions, but I'm leaving it to you guys first. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, are we able to get contact information of some of the panelists afterwards, or are you guys gonna share that with us?
Yeah, of course. We'll have time at the end if you want to go up to any of the panelists. I'm not sure if there's a way, depending on the email list, to send information, but we can see after. Anybody else? All right, I'll start with a question. But again, I think and anybody could take this question. But the panel here discussed, again, the different repression that we're seeing from high school to college to even employees to organizations, but also in that, and Shaza, you put it so beautifully, of organizers themselves have such a clear concept of like what is at risk. And not only now, we're at 1 year, right? October is coming up in 2 weeks. So not only are we seeing 1 year later this escalated repression in all these areas and from federal agencies, but we're also seeing that the organizing has not stopped. If anything, it's escalated, it's moved forward, it's become more empowered. So I wanted to pose the question to the audience of how would you advise to organizers or students in general to navigate this very fine line of being strategic and sustainable, but also realizing that we still are in an emergency response, right? A genocide is still happening and it gets worse day by day. So I know, big question, but if any of the panelists want to go ahead and take that one. Is it that hard, guys? I was looking at you, Dylan, but I wasn't going to put you on.
I was hesitant to grab the mic because I was like, I'm doing a bad job of this myself in terms of keeping my own energy levels up and ability to maintain, a useful posture through the many arduous weeks and months that we're all living through. And I think that my answer is, something you've probably already heard from me today, and it's a simple one, but we need to lean on each other, right? I think that one of the, benefits of times of crisis is that it brings people closer together. I know, if I can speak for myself, that I've built many really, really powerful bonds in the past 11 months that I know will be lifelong ones, and that comes from struggling together. And I think that those relationships are key to building a sustainable movement, right? So I think it means forgiving one another when conflicts spill over and become difficult to manage. It means knowing when to shoulder the burden from the people, when you're in a community space or work environment or organizing group, what have you, where everyone's shouldering a heavy load. There are times when people are under more stress, under less stress, and figuring out how to share that burden effectively is really the only way to make a movement sustainable. So, I think it's acknowledging the community that has been built in these months, and relying on it to transition, really. Because yes, we're in an emergency moment for sure, but I think one of the things that we're learning about this moment is that what has been revealed are deep structural flaws in our society, right? The reason why that this moment has continued this far is because of some profoundly cynical things that have been exposed about the United States government, which means that our movement is a long-term one, right? And it extends beyond a ceasefire, and it may even extend beyond the liberation of Palestine. And I think that is important to recognize, and that the sustainability question is really hard, but it's a lifelong challenge.
Anyone have any other questions? All right, I think if you want to get back to the other.
All right. Okay, so our third topic, we're going to switch into talking about policy and legislative progress, concerns, and challenges. And Yasmin, I want to start with you here. Can you tell us about your work at Empower on federal and congressional lobbying this past year, and then give us an overview of what the ceasefire movement has looked like on that level as well?
Sure. So as has been noted, I lead Empower's legislative and political work. So I also run our C4s, which does all of our electoral work. And right now, so pre-October 7th, so Empower, for those that are familiar with it, it's actually the largest Muslim digital organization in the US, with over 500,000 members currently. And prior to October 7th, our work covered a host of different issues, including criminal justice, peace and diplomacy, anti-war issues, surveillance, etc. And since October 7th, just like I imagine many of my other colleagues and partners that we work with, I've only been working on Gaza. So that's all I do 24/7. And the way I would say, at least, I don't know if it's helpful how the ceasefire movement kind of came about is, so we were in touch with Representative Tlaib and Representative Bush's office immediately after October 7th, along with a couple of other partners. So we worked with them very kind of closely on the resolution that you all know about, ceasefire now resolution that Representative Bush introduced. So I would say that's kind of the very initial points in terms of how the community came together in being able to kind of come around and focus on one vehicle that we wanted to push the entire movement towards. And shortly after the introduction of the ceasefire now resolution, that kind of became the very main ask, right, of the movement. Folks, the grassroots asking their members to co-sponsor, grassroots constantly pressuring leadership, to have a vote on it. And after that, as you all may have seen, that kind of shifted towards other issues that we've been now trying to amplify. So right now, we're now, unfortunately, again, coming towards 1 year since October 7th. So my organization has really been focusing on a lot of the issues around the arms transfers. So whether it was lobbying around the supplemental with our partners right now, the main ask of Empower, many of the partners that we work with, is on the arms embargo. And the reason for that is, it's very clear that the US is not enforcing its own laws and is not in compliance with IHL, international humanitarian law. And in order to be in compliance and to be able to enforce our own laws, any and all offensive arms to Israel needs to be suspended. The brass just kind of took a different terminology and calling it an embargo, and the reason for that is Representative Presley, for months now, has been telling advocates that she is going to introduce an arms embargo bill. I'm not sure if that's still going to happen, but that's how the ask actually came about. It came through coordination with our progressive champions on the Hill, and as folks here may have seen, it became the main ask of the uncommitted movement. None of this is coincidental. All of us are coordinated. Empower is a steering committee member of the uncommitted movement. We've been kind of working with them very closely on the work at the DNC and elsewhere. But I don't know if it's helpful to also talk about some of the partnerships, or we can get into that later.
I think we've got a question or two about that later.
Okay.
All right, so Sulla, you're the executive director for CARE here in New Jersey. What are some of the ongoing local New Jersey policy battles that CARE is fighting right now?
Yeah, thank you. So most recently, CARE has partnered up with PACC, AMP, and a few other local groups to combat IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. So IRA has historically been used and weaponized, and the definition of anti-Semitism weaponized to silence criticism of Israel. In New Jersey, for the past 5 years, from my experience, there's always been a kind of version of this bill that defines anti-Semitism. And every year, we've always been able to defeat it. It's never left the committee. And that every year it pops up in different ways and versions and drafts and different sponsors, etc. But it's never had much success. We've always been able to issue op-eds, have in-person meetings with politicians, and express our concern that it's a free speech issue, and it chills free speech. Even the ACLU is in clear opposition to the IRA definition, and this usually does the trick, and we have no issue. This year we're facing clear opposition where the Zionists are very organized, but not as organized as we are. But this is interesting because Halima from PACC earlier told me that the testimonies that were offered over Zoom and the written testimonies, the pro-Palestinian organizing movement in New Jersey offered double of that which the Zionists offered, both written and verbal, but yet still both bills passed the Senate committee for the first time. So just very briefly, for those that don't know, making sure I have the right name. Yes, so the first bill, and this is the first time where the bill actually has funding allocated to it. So the first bill establishes a state definition of anti-Semitism, creates a public awareness campaign, and appropriates $100,000. The second one requires definitions of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to be included in state diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging policies, and is any policy for recipients of state funds. So both bills, I believe, passed the state committee. Again, for the first time in the past 5 years that I've been with CARE New Jersey. So we're continuing to track it, make sure that it does not build any momentum. This is an issue, and I'm not going to jump the gun here. I think we're going to get into this a little bit more later as to why this is a problem. But we are monitoring the progress of the bill. Again, this is the first time it's passed committee. In the assembly, I don't believe it has a version of its own. There were different drafts and different versions that did not match up with the existing draft that passed committee. But the fear is that it will chill free speech, and obviously it conflates the critique of Zionism and the state of Israel, or with the discrimination against the Jewish community and anti-Semitism. So it's something that obviously many chapters across the country and states across the country have wrestled with, and we're seeing its progress here in New Jersey, so we're monitoring that. Yeah.
Thank you. Dylan, you all are also dealing with these anti-Semitism bills across the country. What are the legal problems with the IRA definition Salah just talked about and some of the potential challenges?
Thank you, and yeah, Salah did a great job describing some of the issues with the IRA definition, so I'll be relatively brief here, and I'll also say that, you know, we're supporting people who are fighting against these in their states and cities and communities, but the real opposition work is happening on the ground in each jurisdiction. People are mobilizing, and it's been actually heartening to see, you know, in dating back several years, this is a long push for the IHR definition, and groups on the ground have had a decent amount of success in being able to defeat it. But yes, definitely since October, the ground has shifted a bit. So what are the problems of the IHRA definition? So the IHRA definition on its face, so the actual text of the definition itself, is relatively non-controversial. It's not really something that I or anyone in this room would object to. The problem is that it comes included with it a set of illustrative examples, and this is where it gets really problematic, because the majority of the examples are not about Judaism. They have to do with criticism of Israel, right? So examples of things that the IHRA in its illustrative examples says are anti-Semitism, calling Israel a racist colonialist state, right? Now, this is a very academically supported position. Whether or not anyone agrees with it, it's very obvious this is a question of politics, right? And the political ideology. It is not an expression of anti-Semitism. Also, I believe it's listed in the IHRA definition that drawing comparisons between the Israelis and the Nazis, Nazi Germany, counts as a version of anti-Semitism. Now, I think anyone who has seen the images coming out of Gaza for the last 11 months will be able to tell you that that's ridiculous. That's an absolutely acceptable comparison to make. In fact, it's a very prudent one. So clearly what this definition is trying to do is to sneak in defense for Zionism as a political ideology into the realm of anti-discrimination, right? And so that poses, real legal problems in terms of, insofar as this definition is adopted and implemented by any public entity, that has real First Amendment concerns, right? The First Amendment is supposed to be the body of law that regulates the limits on speech, and is really supposed to protect political expression. That is the point of the First Amendment. And to use the anti-discrimination framework in order to litigate what kinds of political criticism are or aren't acceptable is a total perversion of that body of law. So the other thing I'll just name with respect to the IRA definition, then I'll end, is that it really harms two groups of people most significantly in the United States insofar as it's applied, right? One is Palestinians. So Palestinians, under the IRA definition, are being called anti-Semites, being labeled anti-Semites for talking about their own family's histories, right? Being able to talk about, if you're a younger middle-aged Palestinian or student, a Palestinian American student, and you want to talk about your family's history and dispossession, and what your grandparents may have experienced during the Nakba. What the IHRA definition does is say you can't do that, right? You can't do that. Or if you do it, you have to be in these very narrowly constrained terms that will actually sanitize you sharing that experience and you sharing your family's lineage, right? The other group that is affected by this definition is anti-Zionist Jews, right? Because anti-Zionist Jews, under the logic of the IHRA definition, are told that they're effectively not Jewish, right? That those criticisms they hold are a form of discrimination against themselves, right? That actually doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't work, and really it serves to exclude anti-Zionist Jews from Jewish communal spaces on campuses and elsewhere, and to say, to America and to everyone else, that the only way to be Jewish is to be a Zionist, and that's really, really profoundly harmful.
Yeah, it's so incredibly broad. It just essentially sounds like you're describing if you're pro-Palestinian or anti-Semitic. So if this anti-Semitism bill passes, can you give us some examples of what the potential consequences could be for students, employees, other governments? What will that mean?
Absolutely. There are a few individuals and groups I can think of that could be impacted. So in New Jersey, if this were to pass, I can immediately think of some of the elected officials who are in office that might speak out against the occupation. Even local officials like city councils or Board of Education members. The Board of Education specifically, say we had one member who speaks out and is critical of Israel, and someone brings a complaint against them, files a complaint with the School Ethics Commission, and it goes all the way up to the School Ethics Commission. School Ethics Commission could reference the bill and the definition that is provided by the state, because the state has something that is passed, it's codified, it's there, it's in front of them, and they're obligated to use it to determine and measure behaviors and practices. So the School Ethics Commission could reference it and determine whether or not the individual who was critical of Israel is guilty of biased behavior, biased practices, and is in fact either anti-Semitic or not. So it is a weapon, it is a tool to even censor elected officials who might be in office. Even students, for example. Rutgers University could use it to determine whether or not their students are participating in behaviors that are impermissible, that this law might deem anti-Semitic. It's going to be used as a tool to measure and determine whether or not practices or behaviors are tolerable. So whether it's government agencies, government departments within the state of New Jersey, universities, public universities, or even private universities, ultimately those who are in authority, who are in power, who are in positions to make decisions, are going to look to see what law exists, what definitions exists, what can we use that's out there to interpret what's happening, and how can we use that to punish people who are speaking out against Israel. So to have a codified definition that conflates anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism obviously puts all of us at risk, whether you're a student, you're an employee, you're an elected official, what have you. It can be used as a tool to punish your speech.
All right, we'll shift a little bit now. Dylan, Palestine Legal put out a really interesting report on student doxing in the very first few months of the genocide. But since then, what direction have things taken? Where do you see them going now?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, one of the initial forms of repression that we saw on campuses and elsewhere was doxing. And we did talk about that in our Reverberations of October 7th report on the first several months of the genocide and the repression in the United States. And I think that there was a very strong movement, collective defense and safety response to that, which is that students and protesters got the message, right? That there are people who are looking to expose their personal information, subject them to harassment, and subject them to retaliation and employment and institutional affiliations. And so we saw students increasingly wearing face coverings, engaging in protests for their own safety. Not to mention that COVID-19 still an existing thing. And so students, would wear, students and anyone really, or a lot of people participating in mobilizations, wear masks, wear keffiyehs around their face to engage in protest. And we have in the months, first part of this year, what we've seen is efforts to criminalize wearing masks, which is a really scary phenomenon. But we've seen it, first it was floated by different mayors, and then it was actually enacted in several places. And I think just a couple of days ago, there was an arrest in Nassau County under one of these anti-mask rules. And it's really dangerous. It's really dangerous, obviously, on the level of public health, right? So telling people that they can't wear masks when there is still a pandemic infecting people is very problematic. And they may have, some of them have public health carve-outs, but you are imposing a culture where mask wearing is associated with criminality, and that's very dangerous. And then of course there is that how it dovetails with the doxing, right? So it's saying to student protesters, if you show your face, we're going to blast your face, right? We're going to take pictures of you and send it to these smear sites and right-wing media outlets, what have you. And if you don't show your face, then we're going to stick the cops on you. And that's a profoundly threatening situation. And we've also already seen it be used to do end runs around the First Amendment, right? So a public institution can't discriminate against an event on the basis of its subject matter, right? But by having these anti-mask rules on the books, then they have an excuse, they have a pretext with which to arrest people, shut down events, what have you. So it's a dangerous trend, and it's something that we're keeping our eye on, and would hope that there's efforts to push back and prevent widespread adoption of those kinds of new repressive efforts that are responding to what the movement is doing.
That's great, thank you. Yasmin, in your federal lobbying work, we talked a bit about that now, but can you tell us what the community focus is right now that you're seeing and how those efforts are going?
Sure. So I spoke a little bit about this earlier, but so the community's asks have shifted somewhat since October of 2023. When our initial ask was focused on securing an immediate and lasting ceasefire. Right now, I would say our community, our organization and the partners that we work with in terms of our lobbying is very heavily focused right now on the UNRWA Restoration Act, which I mentioned earlier, that's being introduced this week. Again, I would really encourage you, if your member has not, and you'll see it, it'll be introduced on Thursday. You'll probably see a press release and you can see if your member is on it or not. And I would highly encourage you to call on them to join as a co-sponsor. And then the other two issues that I mentioned in passing earlier is the arms embargo that we've been trying to secure legislation both in the House and the Senate. So in the House, Representative Presley has been working on it. We were trying to secure a lead in the Senate. It's been rather challenging and difficult, but that's the other kind of main ask that our organization is focused on in terms of arms transfers. And then finally, you may have seen that Senator Sanders has said that he's committed to introducing a JRD, which is called a Joint Resolution of Disapproval. This is a privileged resolution, which means that if he introduces it, essentially trying to block one of the recent notices of arms transfers that we've seen being sent to Israel. It's privileged, it'll get a vote. He's done this in the past. I mean, the great thing with it is that because it's privileged, it's gonna get a vote, and we can ensure that we put, senators, put pressure on them and, get them on the record where they stand on this issue. The challenging part with a JRD, as you may have seen, is that it's generally only supported by less than a handful of members or so. But that's something we're working on. And if you have any questions about that, if you want to encourage your senators to join and you need talking points, happy to work with you on that as well.
Great, thank you. Sela, what has on the ground organizing look like at the organizational level? What pushback have you received? What's been effective? We've talked a lot about individuals and community organizing, but for organizations, what does it look like for you?
Yeah, multiple fronts. So there's a lot of work being done. I'm sure many of you have participated in the activities, whether it's against IRA or other legislation in New Jersey. For IRA and the push that we are leading against it has been kind of multifaceted, right? So a lot of what we're seeing is very effective is going to elected officials and engaging them directly in person and sitting down and having very diverse coalition partners standing with us. So when you have diversity in your allies and your friends and those who are echoing your sentiment, that goes a long way. And we've noticed that that's what's most important. We have to center in our conversations that, look, it's not just a quote unquote Muslim issue or a Palestinian issue. This is, first of all, it's a freedom of speech issue, and the ACLU and the Latino organizations and the Black organizations and the secular organizations and the Muslim organizations and the Jewish organizations, et cetera, are all in opposition to these bills. So expressing that kind of united front that we have is really what we lead with in all of our advocacy. And then just hitting elected officials through multiple ways, right? Obviously online, raising education, kind of the public's understanding and education on the issues, op-eds and other modes of kind of communication and articles, using the media for this purpose, using our relationships with journalists and reporters to educate the public, and using that to put pressure on elected officials. This is kind of what we find to be most effective, kind of raising the public's consciousness of these issues and kind of pressuring elected officials to listen to their constituency. This is how we approach most of it, especially the IRA definition.
All right, thank you. So to close out our policy legislative progress discussion, we've talked about the severe effort to criminalize and punish activists. That includes, people that are the community people pushing for a lot of this. What is CLEAR's outlook or strategy for addressing this going forward based on everything we've learned in the last year?
Yeah, I think our strategy is twofold. In the first instance, we need to make sure that people have the legal support and the general support that they need to continue doing this work. And so that means, on the one hand, any of the policies and practices that are used to repress, we need to make sure that we're addressing them head on wherever the opportunity arises, and making sure that people know that we have their backs and that these resources are available to them, and that we're then doing that. And then I think the second really important strategy, it's always been our strategy at CLEAR, is democratizing the legal knowledge that people really need to keep their collectives safe. So some of what that has looked like in the past few months, I'll give an example because I think it demonstrates the principle. I spoke at the beginning of this presentation about this, the police repression that protesters are facing on the street, and that student organizers also were facing on their campuses.
Died. I can speak loud. Should I demonstrate? Oh.
It's back alive, thank you. Great touch. This sort of punishment by process on the street by police, this was really taking a major toll on organizers and continues to, this practice of facing police brutality and ultimately regular arrests. And it's very complicated figuring out, like, for organizers and folks, like, how to locate the people that are arrested at the protests, where they're going to come out from, how to decipher the charging documents that they receive associated with the arrests, and then how to ensure that they're getting, like, the legal representation that they need in criminal cases. It's a very convoluted process. And so we've developed a curriculum and a training for every stage of that process, because it doesn't require legal expertise. It just requires a certain level of knowledge and exposure. And it then permits organizers to take care of one another. So it's a new reality that people are arrested on a regular basis at protests, and now organizers know how to support one another all the way through the culmination of their legal proceedings. So that's an example. And then continuing on with a lot of the rights awareness workshops that we have been doing for years on, law enforcement contact. It's that type of workshop, I think, that produces the woman chasing the FBI back into their car and down the driveway, on workshops on how to do charitable giving in a way that mitigates risks. And then one that I really want to highlight, workshops on navigating scrutiny while traveling. We really have seen an intense uptick in scrutiny at the borders, and people just don't know that they have much more power in those interactions than they realize. You do not have to unlock your phone or provide the passcode at the border, and we know that Customs and Border Protection has really been reflexively making people give them troves of data at the border, and just having more information about all of these various contexts is very empowering, because we actually have just a lot more power than we realize in these contexts to keep ourselves safe, but most importantly, security and safety in these fields is as heightened as it is collective. Like, if we all make sure that we know how to deal with these encounters with the state, we're keeping our neighbors safe just as much as we're keeping ourselves safe. We're keeping our co-organizers safe just as much as we're keeping ourselves safe.
Thank you, Sheza, for closing us out on that. So we're going to transition now to our last topic before the Q&A. And the last thing, which is what's on everybody's mind, which is why we wanted to close out on it, is the 2024 election, Muslim voting rights, and our democracy. Raise your hand in the audience if you feel confident that a pro-ceasefire, pro-Palestine presidential candidate can win the election. Okay. For the record, no hands are raised. Raise your hand if you feel like your vote matters. Okay, just like 5 or 6. All right, and so we haven't heard from Hani in a little bit, but that's because we're saving the best for last. He's a deep thinker and is going to be able to talk to us about this.
I don't know about that.
So, Hani, the presidential election is on everyone's mind. What impact has the genocide in Gaza had on the Muslim vote, and what can we expect to see in the next couple of months?
Yeah, I think to start off with this question, we should talk about what the Muslim vote has looked like over the last several decades. Before 9/11, it was unclear whether Muslims voted as a bloc, and especially, even if you look at the 2000 election, Muslims overwhelmingly voted for Bush, actually, in a lot of states. Obviously, 9/11 changed that, and we saw a bloc develop amongst the Muslim community to support the Democratic Party over the years, in culmination with the Trump election, especially. And that isn't actually unique, even though, the Muslim communities, I would say, socially conservative mostly. And that's actually not unique. We see a lot of minority communities, immigrant communities that are socially conservative vote for more liberal candidates as a way of self-preservation to protect their rights as a community. We see it across the board. And so I think, after 9/11, we saw a bloc develop eventually where Muslims were voting mostly for the Democratic Party. There were still obviously outliers. You had local Muslim Republican candidates throughout the early 2000s. But a lot of that, I think, the kind of the veering of the Republican Party more rightward and just being more openly racist, and more just openly anti-Muslim, clearly stating it in their, the presidential candidate himself stating anti-Muslim statements, made it clear that Muslims generally going to be voting in a bloc. I think what is happening in Gaza has kind of shown the Muslim community in a lot of ways that this kind of big tent effort that the Democratic Party has is not really that strong, and maybe the Democratic Party never, in some ways represented the Muslim community's interests to begin with. And we're seeing these fissures now develop. And I think what we're going to see, and who knows what's going to happen, but we've already seen that a lot of Muslims are going to sit out the election, maybe not vote for the top ticket, candidates, and vote more down ballot races. Muslims voting only for pro-ceasefire candidates from top to bottom, and also Muslims voting for the Green Party, which has come out against the genocide. So I think we're seeing a more developed and stronger effort, because that always existed within the community, even in the 2008 election, afterwards. But now it's that part of the greater movement for liberation of Palestine is it's impacting how movements within elections are developing too. And so I think it's unclear what's going to happen, but I think we're going to see less support for the Democratic Party. And the reason that could have a huge impact on the party and the Muslim community's relationship with the Democratic Party is because of a lot of local elections. I think Democrats might be impacted, but also nationally, we saw in 2020 a huge outpouring of support for Biden in Michigan and other key swing states, which eventually helped win Biden the election. And we saw Muslims voting in coalition with other minority groups to hand Democrats the elections across the board. And if that is missing, then it could have a huge impact on the party. And also, I think after the election, have a huge impact on how the Democratic Party views the Muslim vote. Whether it was a vote that they were taking for granted, or whether it's something that they're not too interested in because we're still too small of a community for us to matter nationally. I personally think our community on national efforts have made a huge impact on elections in the past, as I give the example of the 2000 election and the 2020 election, but we'll see what the major parties think after this election.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting to think about where we'll be after this election as a community. Yasmin, one thing many of us have noticed in the last year is more awareness in the general population, more interesting partnership building. I think Salah mentioned, the effectiveness of these diverse coalitions. What has your experience been this past year with movement building?
Yeah, absolutely. I can give you just one example of one project that Empower worked on. So during the student encampments, aside from the work we were doing kind of on the ground with some of our leaders going to the various protests, we were also providing them with tools to be able to contact university administration in terms of amplifying their asks. We also organized this kind of national statement in support of the student encampments and solidarity, and also in support of their asks, which was on divestment. So we had over 250 organizations representing tens of millions of their members sign on to this statement. A ton of progressive organizations that I've never seen take positions on Palestine, Gaza, a ton of unions, national climate organizations, Greenpeace, 350.org, Working Families Party, Movement for Black Lives. That's just one example of how I would say the entire progressive movement has really showed up for Palestine this past year, and which I would say is very different than other issues that we've worked on and mobilized around ever. And then the other two things I wanted to mention around elections is the other coalition that came about that was launched earlier this year that we are a part of, and it was launched in March of this year. It was nearly 24 organizations that came together, formed a coalition called Reject APAC. And the title of the coalition is very clear what our purpose is. These are all C4s that came together to try to counter the influence of APAC's money endorsements in the Democratic Party. And our goal and intent is to try to make APAC as toxic as the NRA in the Democratic Party. So a component of this coalition is we are reaching out to members of Congress and encouraging them to sign a Reject APAC pledge, which says that they commit to not accepting any donations from APAC or its affiliates or an endorsement from APAC. And the reason why we obviously did that, and there's a couple of reasons I just wanted to quickly highlight, is the times that unfortunately APAC has showed up in our primaries, our ceasefire champions have lost. So for my organization and other C4s partners that we work on, we immediately after October 7th, once we got into primary season, we knew that APAC was going to be heavily targeting our ceasefire champions. And that's exactly what happened. So, we showed up very strongly for Summer Lee. And as folks remember, Summer Lee making that, she won her primary very strongly. And she made that kind of famous quote where she said, opposing genocide is both good policy and good politics. And she also won her race because APAC stayed out of it, because the person that was running against Summer wasn't a strong candidate, wasn't well liked. They knew Summer was going to win. They stayed away. The two races that APAC unfortunately got involved in, that folks in this room know, that we lost some of our biggest champions, and Cori Bush is one in particular because she was the author of the ceasefire not resolution. That really, really hurt. I mean, it was really painful for so many of our organizations because she was, the leader, at least to us, to our partners, she was the leader of the ceasefire movement along with Rashida. But I wanted to highlight that the only way that Cori and Jamal lost their races was because APAC threw in about $30 million in those two races. That is the only reason they lost. So it's not that they lost because they, were supportive of ceasefire, opposing genocide, speaking, loudly in support of Palestinian human rights. No, they lost because of the money. So, I just wanted to highlight that that's something that unfortunately our community still needs to work on. We need more C4s started within our communities, and there's a number now that have started after October 7th, but that's an area that I think that we need to invest more resources in, be able to really empower our C4s to be able to tackle this big money and interference in our elections.
That's really interesting. I had not heard about that. I think that's an awesome plan of action. Right, so Hani, in this upcoming election, many Arabs, Muslims, our allies feel that neither party represents us. As a voting rights expert, is there any point in voting? What is our place in this democracy?
I think those are two great questions, and really important questions, especially now. So I'm going to tackle the first question first, and I'm going to give a couple of examples of why I think there is a point in voting. The first example is a case that I worked on in San Marcos, Texas, where Hays County, Texas, where Texas State is located. For elections before, and this was I think in 2018, they had they would either not have a polling location at the student center, and this was a red county, mostly Republican, or they would only provide it for a couple of days, I think either in early voting or I think it just in early voting. We were able to, through litigation, get them to put a polling location at the student center. And in that election, the county flipped to blue. And obviously I'm not partisan. The point I'm trying to make is that, and based on that, the county's policies changed. And I want to give I wanted to bring that up to give an example of how when democracy is reflective of the community, it could be huge for making social change. And votes do matter and they can really impact you, especially at a local level. And another example I wanted to give was just that in Fort Bend County, Texas, there was, for the first time, they were planning to use a masjid as a polling location. And there was fierce opposition from several community groups in Fort Bend County. And if anybody knows, Fort Bend County is incredibly diverse and has a huge Muslim population. But despite that, there was a huge backlash. And actually even on county Fort Bend Independent School District letterhead, even the school district or somebody, an official from the school district, opposed having the masjid as a polling location, and brought up security issues, even though there were 12 churches or something that were used as polling locations, and people would feel uncomfortable and all that stuff. And so I bring that up to give an example of people who don't want us voting and don't want polling locations in our community centers. I bring that up because there's a concerted effort across the country, from the local level all the way up to national elections, to make sure that people of color generally, including a lot of Muslims, don't vote, or it's hard for us to vote. And the reason is, and it's done in different ways. It's not just closing polling locations. It could be gerrymandering. It could be making the registration process difficult. There's a whole host of ways to, at a macro level, cut down the number of votes of people of color that we are seeing across the board, especially now, happen. And the reason is because because of our history of discrimination in this country, across the country, we have racially polarized voting. That means in a lot of municipalities across the country, especially in the South, we are seeing white people vote for a white preferred candidate, and people of color generally vote for a person of color, people of color preferred candidate. And so where do we kind of fit in that, right? And I think as an incredibly diverse community, we have recently at least voted in coalition with other people of color to support minority preferred candidates to push for social change that would be beneficial for our communities. And so I think especially at a local level, voting can make a huge difference. And it could be critical to your daily life. And even at a state level and even at a national level. Because if we give up on voting, we've kind of ceded that power to anti-Muslim and anti-communities of color forces. And we see that in Texas. It's a white minority rule state. The majority of the population are people of color. However, because of gerrymandering, because of the voter suppression laws that they have in the state, the statewide positions are white preferred candidates, and they're increasingly incredibly conservative candidates, and they pass laws that end up killing Texans, of color. We've seen anti-immigrant bills passed. We've seen policies by these state officials, like creating, putting razor wire in the water so that people crossing the border will, be like injured and harmed. I mean, these people are doing fascistic things, and putting our communities in danger. And so voting is one field in many fields where there's a grappling of power, a struggle of power. There's the courts, there's mobilized movements. But to give up on voting is to give up, to cede control to forces that don't want us, they don't even want us here, right, in this country. So that's I think the first question. And then is there any point, what is our place in this democracy? So I actually think that I believe at the moment, especially with regard to Palestine, especially the stance that the community in a large way has taken through the uncommitted movement, through efforts to vote, not to vote for the Green Party, to kind of not vote for certain candidates who don't support a ceasefire. All these efforts are, us as a community, I believe, saying that you can't normalize genocide. Like we're willing to sacrifice our rights that we've, supported these candidates who proclaim to push them for on this issue. And this is becoming, Gaza is in a big way, the issue that we are not, in the community at large, or large segments of the community has said they are not willing to budge on. And I think that is profound in a way. And it's us showing our power as a community, that our votes should not be taken for granted. And that, this is, we vote based on our interests, not the interests of any one party. So I think we are an example of what a vibrant democracy can look like. And we'll see we'll see how, we're kind of writing history right now. We'll see what happens after this election, after the election, what the parties do in response to the stand that a lot of people in the community have taken.
All right, so this is our last question, but I think it's on people's minds. You sort of alluded to it, this idea of voting as a bloc, right? As a group. Has coming together as a bloc worked for others?
Yeah. Look, okay, there. Yes, it has. We, as I talked about before, because of racially polarized voting, a lot of voting in American elections, from local all the way up to national, across the country, is bloc voting. A lot of people vote based on, minority preferred candidates, white preferred candidates, and we're seeing that that's historically how it's been because of the history of discrimination. And so the question for has voting as a bloc worked for others? I think, if you look at, to give like a cynical example of how it's worked, is we've seen it work for white conservatives. They vote as a bloc for white preferred candidates, especially during this Jim Crow era, to not only stay in power, but keep power despite shifts in demographics, to pass undemocratic laws, right, that make it difficult for African Americans to register to vote during the Jim Crow era, or to give a more recent example, to gerrymander their districts so they're secure. So that kind of like voting in blocks can make a huge difference. To give kind of the reverse, a more kind of inspiring example is the Black Power movement and the civil rights struggle and Freedom Summer, where there was an effort to register Black people to vote in Mississippi to assert their power, and we saw throughout history how voting as a bloc can really preserve your community. And so I think it could make a huge difference. And I think the most important thing about voting as a bloc is that it allows the community to not be kind of controlled by any one party. They themselves get to decide what issues they want the parties to address for them. And if you come in as a bloc and provide those policy changes, then that is you're more likely to kind of be a show of force for these candidates. And I wanted to give an example of that through a quote by Kwame Ture, who was involved in the civil rights struggle in the South, when he's talking about Black Power. And I think it's something that we should learn from how other communities and be in solidarity with a lot of minority communities who have fought for power and their kind of right place in the society. And I just want to read this quote real quick about what does Black Power mean? Because I think if we kind of apply it to our community, what does building power within the Muslim community, the Arab community, other minority communities who support the liberation of Palestine, if we kind of think about that, I think it can help in our organizing and in our movement work. So Kwame Ture says that Black Power means Black people coming together to form a political force and either electing representatives or forcing their representatives to speak their needs. It's an economic and physical bloc that can exercise its strength in the Black community instead of letting the job go to the Democratic or Republican parties. So really, that's what we need to think about when we think about the Muslim vote and the Muslim community as a bloc. Like, how do we take back control of our power and force these parties to do what we want to see, and not just locally, but also across the world and in Palestine.
That was a really inspiring note to end on. Do we have questions from the audience? Okay, it looks like we have a few, so I'm gonna pass it to Janan. I just wanna thank everyone here. This was really great. Janan will do Q&A and then she can close us out and thank our sponsors as well.
Should I give the mic to him?
Yes.
I got one question from the audience. I don't think I need a mic to speak. Who do I? Okay. Well, thank you so much for that amazing panel. I have a question from the early beginning of the conversation about college campuses and the students on campus. So I go to Rutgers Law School and I see a lot of Muslim and Arab and people, minority on campus. And when I talk to them about these topics, for example, the anti-Semitic bill and stuff like that actually affect their future. And also like the policies that are targeting the students who will graduate eventually and need to get a job, it's all of that. They have no idea what's going on. Like, all what they care about is what's for lunch, what's for, yeah, it's sad, but it's true. Like, unfortunately, our community is not really educated, informed. I wanna call it employed in these fields. And I think I'm new to America. I'm not really from the community here, and I don't know what was happening for the past few years or decades or sort of like that. But I know that there's a lot of work being done since October 7th, and a lot of organizations are trying to involve these young people into the system. So is there like a strategy or a plan to make sure that those kids are involved in the things that you discussed? And that's the first question. The second question is, can I go further? Okay. So the second question is about the policies that are on the table now. So there's a lot of anti-immigrant policies, especially for the Palestinians. I tried the system myself, and it failed, didn't work. I tried to help my family get out of Gaza and come here. I couldn't do anything. And I don't really see our communities addressing that. Like, I know there's some work being done in terms of like reforming the immigration policies in America, but I also don't really think it's effective, or it's not on the table for the Democratic Party and for the Green Party as well. I mean, we talk a little bit about it, but it's not like one of the main topics that they want to address for their agenda. And I was introduced to Arab Americans for Trump, and they promised to do some stuff like that. And I just want to also hear your reflection on that as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'll speak briefly to the first part of your question, which is efforts to mobilize students around some of these issues. And I want to just challenge the frame of it a little bit, because I actually don't think it's important for the student movement to be organizing necessarily around some of the things that we're talking about here. When you talk to students, they are often very newly mobilized. They have really passionate ideas about what they see as wrong with their institutions and their country. And that's what's motivating them to act, right? And that's why we're seeing large-scale demonstrations, because these students are angry. And sometimes on the like nonprofit side of the movement, it's tempting to say, like, if we could only harness all of the energy that the students are bringing towards these like really particular issues that we're seeing or fights that we view as strategic, then we'd win. But really, that's actually like a form of like demobilizing these students, right? That those students should be expressing the anger where they have it, and that radical energy is what's contagious on campuses, and it's actually incumbent upon the other aspects of our movement to be able to mobilize in congressional spaces and in local fights, and to have the policy fights to free those students up to be involved in that kind of organic engagement that they're in. Not quite an answer to your question, but I do think it's a kind of an important point, because I do see it as a place where the movement can go wrong sometimes, which is to try and take students off the street and plug them into a legal process or a legal fight that really is not the best use of their time.
So I can answer the immigration question, and I'm also happy to kind of chat with you afterwards if you have additional questions. So we worked with Representative Cesar and Senator Durbin's office back in June on this bicameral letter that was released on World Refugee Day, that actually 69 members joined, urging the Biden administration for a P2 designation under the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program for Palestinians in Gaza. So what that means is, as we probably know, like, Palestinians have traditionally been kind of excluded from the refugee program, and there had been reports earlier this year that the Biden administration was considering opening these pathways and specifically considering a P2 designation. So we worked with Representative Cesar's office on this letter, led the advocacy on it, and that specifically would help Palestinians in Gaza that have relatives, family members in the US that are either permanent residents or citizens. Happy to also kind of chat with you afterwards if you have questions.
We have a question on the live.
Okay, on YouTube, Miriam K, she wanted to know, she asked this much earlier in the live stream, is there a primary fund or a way to donate to help support the college students who are dealing with legal retaliations from the colleges? Is there like a specific fund?
How should they direct those funds, essentially?
Welcome to donate to us.
Palestine Legal and the National Lawyers Guild have been the primary organizations that field the student protesters, activists, and if they don't represent them, they get them the exact perfect
referral. The Clear Clinic also has been representing some of these individuals. So I would reach out to those organizations to ask where your money would be best spent. All right, we do want to give you all a chance to come up and talk to our panelists. So we're gonna leave it here. I want to thank all of them. This was such a great opportunity to pause, reflect on the past year, think about what's coming up, see what everyone is doing on everything on Gaza in the last year. So thank you to all of our panelists. This was incredible. I also want to thank our sponsor, Beitel Mall. As you guys come up and are able to talk to people, we'll be able to play their video. They sponsored this event. They're a fantastic organization. We appreciate their generosity.
Before I let you guys go, just keep in mind that we have all these events coming up for civic engagement and for our programs, Palestine Education. I just want to say, the opposition is not our enemy. Apathy is. We have a lot of power in our community. We have a lot of power here in New Jersey and in the tri-state area. And out of anywhere else in the country, I think that, I say this often, that they say the US is the heart of the empire. I truly believe the tri-state is the main artery. There's a lot of buying power in these two areas, a lot of union power in these two areas. So it's a matter about being proactive and not reactive. And I think that's a lot of what y'all were discussing up here was about being proactive. So let's continue to communicate with one another, stay plugged into the organizations that are here, including PACC, and let's work together to effectively create change and reshape the political landscape by being engaged, not just during elections, but all year round, and on a consistent and dedicated basis. If we all just did a little bit, then it would go a really, really long way. So keep having these conversations with your families and your networks. If you're within the Muslim and Arab community, then you probably come from a large family. Engage with your family, use relational organizing, and continue to hold yourselves and everybody else around you accountable so that we can really work towards liberation and protecting our community needs here while we're here at the same time. Thank you. Oh, okay. If y'all could just pick up your chairs to help us put it away, that'd be great. Thank you so much.